April 27th, 1945, a convoy of captured German military vehicles rattled toward a field hospital in Bavaria, carrying cargo that would expose the cruelty of desperation and the power of conscience. Inside one truck sat 18 German nurses, members of a Wehrmacht field hospital overrun during the American advance, their wrists bound together with chains like criminals being transported to execution. They were exhausted, terrified, and completely unprepared for what they were about to witness. As the convoy stopped at the American field hospital and guards pulled back the canvas, American medics saw the chains and their faces registered shock, then visible anger, not at the prisoners, but at whoever had done this. What happened in the next 10 minutes would become a story told and retold for generations. A moment when moral courage trumped military protocol and human decency shattered the machinery of war. Before we discover what made hardened combat medics weep as they cut those chains, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 29-year-old nurse Ilse Zimmermann sat in the truck bed, the cold metal shackles cutting into her wrists where they connected her to the nurse beside her. She had served as a surgical nurse at Wehrmacht Field Hospital 2 and 21, tending to wounded German soldiers throughout the war's final desperate months, believing that medical work transcended politics, even as that belief grew harder to maintain. She had been told that American soldiers showed no mercy to captured German medical personnel, that they would be treated as war criminals rather than protected medical staff. She had been told that the chains were for her own protection, to prevent escape attempts, and to make clear to the Americans that these prisoners were secured and controlled. As American soldiers approached the truck, Ilse closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever cruelty awaited. What she experienced instead would challenge everything she understood about enemies, about medical ethics, and about the choices people make when faced with unnecessary suffering. Captain James Morrison, a 34-year-old field surgeon from Philadelphia, approached the truck to assess the new arrivals for medical screening. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. 18 women, clearly medical personnel based on the remnants of their uniforms, chained together at the wrists like slaves. Some had visible wounds. All showed signs of exhaustion and dehydration, and the chains were cutting into their skin, causing bleeding where the metal had rubbed against flesh during transport. Morrison's expression shifted from professional assessment to visible fury in seconds. He turned to the MP sergeant who had escorted the convoy. "Who the hell did this?" he demanded. "Who chained these nurses together?" The MP, a young sergeant named Collins, looked uncomfortable. "Orders from the unit that captured them, sir. They claimed it was standard security protocol for enemy medical personnel." Morrison's voice rose. "Standard protocol? These are nurses, Sergeant, medical staff. They're supposed to be protected under Geneva Convention. And even if they weren't, chaining injured women together for transport is barbaric." He gestured at Ilse's bleeding wrists. "Look at them. They're bleeding. They're in pain. This is inhumane." Collins shifted his weight, caught between orders he had followed, and a superior officer's clear moral outrage. "Sir, I just transported them. I didn't—" Morrison cut him off. "I know, I'm not blaming you, but get me bolt cutters, now. We're removing these chains immediately." He turned to his medical staff. "Get stretchers ready. Some of these women need immediate care. Move." Within minutes, Morrison was kneeling beside the truck bed, bolt cutters in hand, personally cutting through the chains that bound the German nurses. As he worked on Ilse's shackles, he spoke to her in careful German, learned from his medical training. "I'm sorry. This should never have happened. We're going to take care of you." The chains fell away, and Ilse rubbed her raw wrists, staring at this American doctor who was apologizing to her, as if she was owed an apology, as if her suffering mattered to him. Morrison worked his way down the line, cutting each chain, examining each woman's injuries, offering quiet words of reassurance in a mixture of English and broken German. His hands were gentle despite his obvious anger, his touch professional despite his visible distress at what had been done to these prisoners. When all 18 women were freed, he stood and addressed them through a German-speaking orderly. "You are medical personnel. You are under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated as colleagues, not as criminals. What was done to you was wrong, and I apologize on behalf of the United States Army." The apology hung in the air, incomprehensible to women who had been taught that Americans were brutal and merciless. Ilse stared at Captain Morrison, this enemy doctor who had just freed them, tended their wounds, and apologized for treatment he hadn't personally inflicted. The contradiction between propaganda and reality was so stark it felt physically disorienting, like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The morning of April 28th brought the German nurses their first full day in the American field hospital, and with it, more opportunities to observe the unexpected ethics of their captors. They had been given proper quarters in a tent designated for female medical staff, with real cots and blankets. Their wrist wounds had been cleaned and bandaged. They had been fed the same rations as American personnel. And most significantly, they were being treated as medical professionals rather than as prisoners. Captain Morrison made morning rounds, checking on the German nurses as he would check on his own staff recovering from exhaustion or injury. When he reached Ilse's cot, he examined her bandaged wrists with focused attention. "Healing well," he said through the interpreter, a German-American corpsman named Frederick Braun. "No signs of infection. You were lucky. Some chains cause permanent nerve damage." He looked directly at Ilse. "How long were you chained like that?" Ilse struggled to find her voice. 6 hours, she said quietly in German. "Since we were captured." Morrison's jaw tightened. 6 hours. In a moving truck. Without medical attention. He shook his head. "That's not how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. That's not who we're supposed to be." Around the tent, other German nurses were having similar interactions with American medical staff who treated them with professional courtesy rather than hostility. 25-year-old nurse Anna Klein had been terrified that her injured leg would be ignored or inadequately treated, but an American nurse had cleaned and redressed the wound with the same care she would give to an Allied soldier. 33-year-old senior nurse Greta Hoffmann, who had supervised the German field hospital, watched these interactions with growing confusion. The Americans were following medical ethics, even with enemies. They were treating German nurses as protected medical personnel, despite having every reason to view them as complicit in German atrocities. The breakthrough came on May the 1st, during an afternoon when casualties from the ongoing fighting flooded into the field hospital. American medical staff were overwhelmed, working frantically to triage and treat dozens of wounded soldiers. Captain Morrison made a decision that would shock both sides. He approached the German nurses through Frederick Braun. "We need help," he said bluntly. "We have more wounded than we can handle. You're trained medical personnel. I'm asking if you'll help us save American soldiers." The request hung in the air, unprecedented and fraught with complexity. Ilse exchanged glances with Anna and Greta, seeing her own conflict reflected in their faces. They were being asked to help the enemy, to save the lives of men fighting against Germany, but they were also being treated as medical professionals, being given the opportunity to do what they had trained for, heal the wounded, regardless of uniform. Greta spoke first, her voice steady. "We are nurses. Our calling is to heal. We will help." For the next 18 hours, German and American medical personnel worked side by side in organized chaos. Ilse assisted Captain Morrison in surgery, handing him instruments, monitoring vitals, doing the work she had done hundreds of times before, but now for American soldiers. Anna helped with triage, using her experience to assess injuries and prioritize treatment. Greta coordinated with American head nurse Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, their shared professional language transcending national boundaries. Morrison worked with focused intensity, saving lives with skill that commanded respect regardless of nationality. Between surgeries, during a brief moment of rest, he spoke to Ilse through Frederick. "You're good at this. Well trained. How long have you been a surgical nurse? Ilse wiped sweat from her forehead, exhausted but finding strange satisfaction in work that felt meaningful again. 5 years, 2 of those in field hospitals. I trained in Berlin before the war. Morrison nodded. It shows. You have good instincts, good hands. He paused, then added something that would stay with Ilse forever. Medicine should be neutral ground. We're all just trying to save lives. The uniforms shouldn't matter in the operating room. The words articulated something Ilse had felt, but never quite been able to express. In surgery, there was only the patient, the injury, and the team working to heal. Politics and nationality dissolved in the face of medical necessity. She had felt that truth working beside Morrison, had seen it in how American medics treated German nurses as colleagues rather than enemies once the work began. In Germany, she said slowly, we are taught that there is no neutral ground, that everything is about loyalty to the nation. But you are right. In medicine, there should be only the patient. May the 5th, 1945, brought an event that would crystallize the German nurses' transformation in a way that daily cooperation alone could not. Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Captain Morrison called a brief meeting of all medical personnel, including the German nurses, to mark the moment. The war is finished, he announced, his voice heavy with emotion. We won. But I want to say something to our German colleagues who have been working alongside us. He turned to face the 18 nurses, his expression serious. You were chained when you arrived here, treated like criminals. That was wrong. But over the past week, you've saved American lives. You've worked as hard as anyone on my staff. You've proven that medicine transcends war, that healing is a calling that exists beyond politics. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When I cut those chains, I was correcting an injustice. But you've done something harder. You've chosen to heal the men of an enemy army. That takes moral courage. I respect that deeply. Ilse felt tears on her face, overwhelmed by praise from someone she had been taught to view as an enemy. Around her, other German nurses were crying quietly, processing the end of the war and the beginning of an uncertain future. Greta stood, her voice thick with emotion. Captain Morrison, you cut our chains, but you also freed us from something deeper. You showed us that medical ethics are real, that they apply even to enemies, that choosing to do right is more important than following orders. We will never forget this. The weeks following the surrender were marked by a profound shift in the field hospital's operations. The German nurses were no longer technically prisoners, but displaced medical personnel waiting for repatriation. They continued working alongside American staff, helping care for the massive influx of wounded soldiers, refugees, and liberated concentration camp survivors who flooded the medical facilities in occupied Germany. The work was emotionally brutal, especially as the full extent of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. It was during this period that Captain Morrison asked Ilse to accompany him to a nearby displaced persons camp where medical care was desperately needed. Survivors of concentration camps were arriving daily, many in critical condition from starvation, disease, and abuse. Morrison needed experienced nurses, and he trusted Ilse's clinical skills. What she saw at the camp would force her to confront the full scope of what her government had done. The survivors were skeletal, traumatized, barely alive. Ilse worked alongside Morrison, providing medical care while wrestling with horror and shame. She had known the Reich was harsh, had heard whispers of camps, but this systematic destruction of human beings was beyond anything she had imagined. During a break, she found Morrison sitting outside the medical tent, his head in his hands. "How do you process this?" she asked quietly. "How do you keep working after seeing what humans can do to each other?" Morrison looked up at her, his face showing the strain of what they had witnessed. "You acknowledge it. You let it change you. And then you get back to work, because people still need help." He gestured toward the camp. "This is why we fought. This is what we were trying to stop. And this is why I cut your chains the day you arrived. Because if we start dehumanizing people, treating prisoners as less than human, we become what we're fighting against." The words struck Ilse with profound force. Morrison had seen what the Nazis did, had every reason to hate all Germans, but he had still treated German nurses with dignity because his moral code wasn't conditional on reciprocity. He was good not because his enemy was good, but because that was who he chose to be, regardless of circumstances. "I will never be able to make up for what was done," Ilse said quietly, "but I can spend my life trying to do better, to be worthy of the mercy you showed." June 15, 1945, brought news that German medical personnel would begin repatriation to Germany within months. Captain Morrison called the 18 nurses together to explain the process and timeline. "You'll be returned to Germany and released to civilian life. You'll be given documentation acknowledging your medical service under American command, which should help with future employment." He paused, his expression softening. "I want you to know that working with you has been an honor. You've proven that national boundaries don't have to define who we are as medical professionals." Several nurses began crying, overwhelmed by the prospect of leaving and by Morrison's words of respect. Ilse raised her hand, her voice steady despite emotion. "Captain, will it be possible to continue correspondence, to maintain contact with you and the medical staff here?" Morrison looked surprised but pleased. "I don't see why not. Write to the hospital address. Letters will be forwarded." He smiled slightly. "Besides, the medical community is smaller than you think. We might cross paths again at conferences or professional exchanges. The war is over. Former enemies can become colleagues." The following weeks were spent preparing for departure and completing final shifts at the camp and field hospital. The German nurses worked with dedicated intensity, trying to make every moment count, to save every life they could as a form of atonement or tribute, or simply because it was what they had been trained to do. Ilse found herself paired frequently with Morrison in surgery, their professional partnership having developed into a seamless collaboration that required minimal verbal communication. During one of their final surgeries together, Morrison spoke to her between procedures. "You're wasted on field hospitals, Ilse. You should pursue advanced surgical training. You have the skills for it." Ilse looked at him in surprise. "In Germany, after this war? Who would train a nurse from a defeated nation?" Morrison's expression was serious. "The war will end, but medicine continues. Germany will need trained medical professionals to rebuild. And if you want additional training, there are international programs, exchange programs. The medical community doesn't stay divided forever." The idea that she might have a professional future, that her skills might be valued rather than tainted by her nation's crimes, was a revelation. "You cut my chains," Ilse said suddenly, the memory as vivid as the day it happened. "But you also freed me from believing I had no future, no value beyond what Germany told me I was. That freedom is the greater gift." July 20th, 1945. Brought the day of departure. 18 nurses boarded a transport truck, now with cushioned seats rather than chains, heading toward processing centers in occupied Germany. They carried letters of recommendation from Captain Morrison, certificates documenting their medical work under American command, and personal notes from American medical staff who had become colleagues and friends. They would return to a devastated homeland as witnesses to an important truth: that medical ethics could transcend war, that showing mercy to enemies was strength rather than weakness, that choosing humanity over hatred was always possible. As the truck prepared to leave, Captain Morrison approached to say goodbye personally to each nurse. When he reached Ilse, he held out his hand formally. She took it, then on impulse pulled him into a brief embrace, professional boundaries dissolving in the face of genuine gratitude. "Thank you for cutting my chains," she said in English she had been practicing. "Thank you for treating us like humans. Thank you for showing me what medical ethics truly mean." Morrison's eyes were wet as he responded, Thank you for choosing to help us save lives, even though we were your enemy. That choice honors the medical profession more than anything I did." He stepped back, suddenly formal again. "Stay safe, Nurse Zimmermann. The medical community needs good people. Be one of them." The truck rolled through the gates, carrying nurses who had entered as chained prisoners and were leaving as respected colleagues. Ilse watched the field hospital recede, knowing she would never forget the man who had been angry enough about injustice to break protocol, who had been secure enough in his values to apologize for actions he hadn't committed, who had seen medical professionals first and enemies second. The 18 nurses scattered across occupied Germany, returning to destroyed cities and uncertain futures. Ilse found work at a hospital in the ruins of Hamburg, using her skills to care for survivors of the bombing campaigns and refugees flooding from the east. She pursued advanced surgical training through an international exchange program, eventually becoming one of Germany's first female surgeons. She never married, dedicating her life to medicine and to teaching younger doctors that ethics must transcend politics. Anna became a trauma specialist, working in emergency medicine throughout her career. She often told her students about the day she arrived at an American field hospital in chains and left as a colleague, using the story to illustrate that how we treat people in extreme circumstances reveals our true character. She pioneered protocols for treating war casualties that emphasize dignity and humanity regardless of circumstances. Greta worked with medical relief organizations, helping rebuild Germany's healthcare system and training a new generation of nurses in both technical skills and medical ethics. She testified before international medical bodies about the importance of protecting medical personnel during conflicts, citing her own experience as evidence that respecting medical neutrality benefited everyone. But the story's most remarkable chapter came in April 1975, when Captain Morrison, now a prominent thoracic surgeon and professor at Johns Hopkins, organised a medical conference in Munich that included a reunion component for medical personnel who had served together in World War II. He sent personal invitations to all 18 German nurses, 15 of whom were able to attend, travelling from across Germany and even from other countries where they had emigrated. They gathered at a hotel conference centre. Former prisoners and former captors reunited as medical colleagues. Stories were shared in English and German. Tears were shed. And yes, there was professional pride in what they had built over the decades. Morrison attended with his wife and adult children. Sarah Mitchell, the American head nurse, came with her grandchildren. Frederick Braun, the translator, attended as a retired colonel and advocate for German-American medical exchanges. The reunion featured a ceremonial moment that moved everyone present. Morrison had preserved the bolt cutters he had used to cut the chains 30 years earlier. He presented them to Ilse, saying, "These represent a choice, the choice to recognize injustice and correct it, the choice to see humans before enemies, the choice to let medical ethics guide our actions even in war." Ilse accepted the bolt cutters, her hands trembling. "These tools cut metal chains," she said, her English now flawless after decades of international medical work. But Captain Morrison cut chains deeper than metal. He freed us from believing we were worthless, that our skills didn't matter, that our nationality defined our value. Those invisible chains were harder to break than steel. She raised her glass, and all the German nurses stood with her. To Captain Morrison, who was angry at injustice even when the victims were enemies, who apologized for actions he didn't commit because he understood institutional responsibility, who treated us as colleagues when he could have treated us as criminals. You showed us that medical ethics are not abstract principles. They are choices we make every day about how we treat the vulnerable. Morrison stood, clearly emotional. You came to us in chains, but you chose to help us save lives. That choice honored the medical profession more than any oath or declaration. You proved that healing is a calling that transcends war, that medical personnel can maintain their ethics even when their governments abandon all ethics. He looked at each woman. You asked me once how I keep working after seeing terrible things. The answer is that I work alongside people like you, people who choose to heal rather than harm, who maintain their humanity even in inhumane circumstances. That gives me hope. Greta raised her own glass, her voice carrying clearly through the room. To the bolt cutters that freed our wrists, to the apology that freed our spirits, to the medical ethics that freed our consciences, to Captain Morrison and all who choose mercy when vengeance would be easier, who choose humanity when hatred would be simpler, who choose to be good not because others deserve it, but because that is who they choose to be. The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing through a space filled with people who had proven that even in war's darkest moments, moral courage could triumph over expedience. They had demonstrated that recognizing injustice and acting to correct it, even in small ways, could plant seeds of transformation. The German nurses, who had been chained like criminals but treated like colleagues, had learnt the most important lesson of all: that how we respond to the vulnerable and powerless defines our true character, that medical ethics must transcend politics and nationality, and that the choice to be decent when cruelty would be easier is the highest form of professional and personal integrity. And it all began with a doctor who was angry enough about injustice to break protocol, secure enough in his values to apologize for actions he hadn't committed, and committed enough to medical ethics to see colleagues first and enemies second. Those bolt cutters, cutting through chains in a moment of moral clarity, proved that choosing humanity over hatred is always possible, even in war.